a rather remarkable exchange over the weekend between a news presenter for GB News across the pond in merry old England, Camilla Tominey, with the British Health Secretary, a guy named James Murray. And it was on the evolution of the good health secretary's views as to what a woman is. You would think an adult male who's a health secretary in a first world government would have pretty codified views about what constitutes a biological woman and whether or not someone impersonating a woman is the same thing as a woman. But then again, in this country, we have a Supreme Court justice who is a bit perplexed on the issue as well. Here is that exchange.
But you are quite pro-trans, aren't you? You've appeared in campaigns and things. I mean, do you think a woman can have a penis? Because you did previously. It's an important question for a health secretary to answer.
No, I don't.
So you've changed your mind?
Yes.
Why have you changed your mind?
Well, I think a lot of us have been thinking about this issue over recent years. And, I wouldn't now say that, for instance, trans women are women. I think that biological sex is important.
But you must have known that before. You're very well educated. You went to St Paul's private school, I was reading this morning. How on earth could you have previously thought that a woman can have a penis?
Well, I think this is an issue that a lot of us have thought about in recent years. And I think there's a difference between sex and gender. I think that when it comes to sex, biology is what matters. And that's why...
Do you owe women who called for, who were gender critical and then were cancelled an apology?
Look, I don't think people should be cancelled. I think people should be allowed to have their views.
But part of the reason these women were cancelled is because people like you denied biological sex and then they were hounded on by the trans lobby.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, Mr. Health Secretary, did you rally to the defense of, say, J.K. Rowling when she was being pilloried for saying what you're now saying? No. This guy's in his 50s, I think. Really? And well-educated, as Ms. Tominey mentioned. And for a long time, he thought that a person with a penis was not a woman. And then he didn't, and now he does again. Gosh, what could explain that? Just wrestling with his views over a period of time? Or the politics of the time and folding in? For more on the topic, pleased to be joined by Megan McArdle, Washington Post columnist, and author of the very good book, The Upside of Down, Why Failing Well is the Key to Success. I read this when it first came out a while back. It's very good read. Megan McArdle, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So, it's an interesting epiphany that the health secretary across the pond has had, even though he can't really explain it other than to say he and other people have been ruminating on this for a while now, and they've come to a different conclusion, or he has, than he previously held in the same position.
Yeah, I think this is a good example of what the economist Timur Kuran has labeled preference falsification. There was a period in elite institutions, and that includes politics, especially left-wing politics, but also media, academia, nonprofits, and so forth, where activists had pressed people to embrace a series of propositions. Trans women are women in every sense that matters, that there was no difference between biological male and female athletes, that the evidence behind puberty blockers and pediatric medical transition was rock solid, and that the procedures were, as the media kept repeating, they are evidence-based and medically necessary. And those propositions weren't adopted because we'd had a long debate about them and people had thought them through and decided that they believed something. It was not like marriage equality where we thought about that for a long time, and eventually the public decided that it supported gay marriage. This was a top-down effort by activists who pressed sympathetic institutions that mostly leaned left to adopt their framing of some very complicated issues and to not interrogate them. to ask questions about biological males in women's sport, to ask questions about pediatric medical transition was to be branded a bigot, and people were afraid of that. And so a lot of people just unthinkingly adopted these positions, and they became, there's the journalist Jesse Singal pointed out that the CNN style book, Clearly Somewhere, or their policies, had this evidence-based, medically necessary, some version of that phrase, was clearly supposed to be appended to any discussion of puberty blockers and hormones for kids, to the ridiculous extent that when the Cass report, a government report from the UK, came out pointing out the incredibly low quality of the evidence for these interventions, right in that report they just stated as a fact that these were evidence-based and medically necessary.
Right.
And all of that has put people in an awkward position. They got way out over their skis. They went way beyond what the public was willing to support, and they didn't have either the argument base, because no one was really arguing. They were just stating these things as facts, these opinions as facts. They didn't have the evidence, and they adopted policies they brought lawsuits that were based on the assumption that this was the emerging consensus. The vanguard of history was marching, and pretty soon everyone would be on the same page. And that was not true. And so now you're seeing people who are embarrassed by this, frankly, silly behavior. Regardless of what you think about trans women in sports or anything else, these are positions that have to be argued. You have to know what the evidence is. And the people who were at the vanguard of this didn't have good evidence, and they hadn't persuaded anyone. And that has left everyone in a bad place.
No, they would just issued edicts that that ran completely afoul of the evidence and people's, experience in the real world, which is things like it's unclear if boys have physical advantages over girls in sports.
Yeah.
Right. It's just like you can't, you make that statement and people are like, and this is when even girls, you started having female athletes at every level coming forward and saying, come on, that's ridiculous.
Yeah. So I think the biggest issue in terms of the importance and the damage that may have been done, I think we don't know on puberty blockers and hormones, what the effects of these interventions are. There's just no good evidence for them, but we don't have a lot of great evidence against them either. We just don't have good evidence. But if it turns out that these don't help in the way that the advocates for these interventions were promised, then obviously this is a really big deal, because you've got kids and then eventually adults who have had their bodies altered for the rest of their lives in a way that is very permanent, requires lifelong medical intervention, can have serious side effects. And then I think things like, allowing biological males to self-ID into women's prisons, which has been policy in various places, not just in the United States, but in the world. Those are, to me, the most serious things. But I think that the issue of trans women in sports was the worst mistake, because that was, these other policies relied on this expert credentials and the deference that we give to people who studied a topic closely. I don't think the experts did their jobs on these things, but people were willing to extend a certain amount of trust because these were scientists and they had papers and data. And then you got to people like Leah Thomas in the trans Penn swimmer who actually transitioned during the pandemic, and so swam for the first 3 years on the men's team, and then swam on the women's team in her last year of college. You had people just saying, like, you don't know that she has any enduring advantage. And you were just telling people, experts say, I hate that phrase because it really, it just borrows credibility rather than earning it. But experts say that this is not a big deal. And you were telling people, do you want to believe the experts or do you want to believe your lying eyes? And the assumption was they were going to believe the experts, and that was crazy. Everyone could see that Leah Thomas, her position, she had been a pretty good swimmer on the men's team, but she became the number one swimmer in her event. on the women's team in the course of a year. Was she training that hard during the pandemic? And so that was the moment at which people said, wait a minute, if the experts say this, then what, and this is obviously and clearly crazy, then what else are they saying that I shouldn't trust?
Right. And I mean, the sports thing also, too, as compared to an individual decision that happens within a family and their medical providers, or like you say, in the prison system, that is a very insular cohort. But once you have, A.B. Hernandez in California winning track meets in girls' sports, a guy winning track meets and all sorts of events in women's sports, now you're opening up to, everybody who's got a kid in high school. And so now you're forcing people to have to deal with this in a way that they may have ignored if it stayed on the margins in those cases.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people will say when I write about this, I sort of accidentally got onto this beat because I was fascinated by the Lily S. Thomas question, and because I'm a 6'2" woman. Your listeners won't know that. But
okay.
People were name-checking me in this debate where people would say, well, males have an advantage. And people would respond, well, sure, most males. But, there are female outliers. Megan McArdle exists. She's 6'2". And I was like, I'm not stronger and more athletic than a man. I don't know. Like, wait a minute. And so I started writing about it. And it was, the advocates would say, well, this is a small number of athletes. And it's true. It is a quite small number of athletes. But then I think if you say, well, it's just a small number of athletes, you have to ask, why are there so many trans female athletes winning events? If it is just a handful of people, I would expect to see not very many of them, and they had no enduring advantage. I would expect to see not very many of them on the champions podium. But we've had state championships won. There are various adult events where trans women have dominated. You saw this in Olympic boxing this year, and this is something where, sure, although with Olympic boxing it was not trans female athletes, it was people who were born with intersex disorders of sexual development, where their bodies don't fully respond to some androgens, the male hormones, and therefore their external genitalia can look quite female. Well, they still have internal testes that are producing testosterone and giving them that male advantage. But all of those issues, of course, got wrapped up together because this had become such a political hot potato. And if it is true that this is not that many people, then why do we see so many people like winning at the elite level?
I mean, even like, Serena Williams in a simpler time said on talk shows, like, if I was on the men's tour, I'd be like 70th. Like, I can't, there's no way I couldn't compete against whatever, a contemporary Andy Roddick on the men's tour or something like on the men's, tennis. She's like, that now she had to sort of silence down because the politics changed. But the reality didn't change. It's just the politics that was happening in those elite circles and elite institutions, including sports and sports media, that you were talking about changed. So you couldn't say what was true, which is, another sort of illustration of the madness of crowds, or at least the madness that silences majority opinion when it occurs in elite institutions.
Yeah, and to go back to that preference falsification concept that we started with, Tim McGraw wrote a great book on this called Private Truths, Public Lies, and he actually says that one of the problems with doing things this way, with forcing people, because people were really terrified. I was shocked. Even I knew this, right? I knew I was kind of like sticking a key into an electric socket when I decided that I was going to write about Leah Thomas. But I was prepared. I was not prepared for going out. It was like, I'm not an investigative reporter. I don't meet people in alleys and, exchange texts on Signal. I write about economics and science, and academics are usually pretty happy to say, yeah, sure, here's my paper. Happy to talk anytime. But when I was writing about Leah Thomas, people are like meeting me in alleys, well, in darkened corners anyway. They are like keeping very quiet. I asked someone just to explain how swim meets work, right? I did not want them to comment on Leah Thomas. I did not want to, just like, what are the rules of swimming? and this person agreed to talk to me only on deep background. They couldn't have their name or any identifying information, and said to me, like, look, I might be willing to do this, but my wife would kill me, and I have kids in swimming, and I can't risk it, right? This is totally insane, the
right.
level of terror people had around this issue. And the problem with enforcing that kind of dogma institutionally is that you're vulnerable to what Quran calls a preference cascade, which is everyone is lying because no one really understands what public opinion is because everyone's afraid to talk. But they still have their private opinions. There's a great couplet from the poet Samuel Butler written in the 17th century. One who complies against his will is of the same opinion still. Mm-hmm. And the minute it starts to become clear that other people have the same concerns you do, you can have like what's a very rapid kind of snowball. A few people speak out, a few other people look at that and they're like, yeah, I agree with them. And then all of a sudden the public apparent consensus shatters.
Well,
and
that's like
the truth reasserts itself.
Yeah, I mean, that's when you have an incident like, Riley Gaines, who became outspoken on this topic, yep. And she gets attacked at a college campus in California because she's going to give a talk on it. That's this kind of stuff where we say, well, reasonable people, even if they don't like Riley Gaines or they're not conservative or whatever, say that is way across the line. Or the treatment of, I mentioned at the outset, J.K. Rowling across the pond, this kind of Harry Potter author who's like this, celebrated because her books are so popular, movies and all that stuff. And she's some sort of monster because she is sticking up for girls playing in girls' sports and stuff. It's like that kind of stuff when you go after figures like that and the way they did it, I think, is off-putting to most people, and it sparks some courageous people to step out. And then, as you say, courage is contagious, just as cowardice.
Yeah, and I think that really tells you about the importance of people having that courage, right? J.K. Rowling was uncancelable. There was actually a movement. Her publishers, employees, tried to get them to cancel her books, and they looked at them like, "Are you crazy? You want me to cancel her? Right. No way! You can go look for another job. I am not ending the money train." But the people who have the courage to speak out early on, it can be lonely. It can be dangerous. People, Jesse Singal, that journalist I mentioned, he kind of got forced out of journalism for a while. Ended up with his own newsletter. He's done very well. He has a podcast. I don't want to say that his life was ruined. But it was really damaging for him just to write, just that detransitioners exist, just that there are people who regret it, and we need to do a better job of trying to sort out the kids who would regret it. That was a real career setback for him. And there were a lot of people who early on, spoke up and expressed, and people like Gaines, people like Rowling, and those people, by being there, create the conditions for the truth to reassert itself.
Meg McArdle is a Washington Post columnist and author of The Upside of Down, Why Failing Well is the Key to Success. And her recent column is Why the Transgender Sports Campaign Was Doomed, which is what we were just discussing. Megan, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And she joined us on the alphawealthgroup.com answer line.
The stories you need to know to start your day. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Making the switch to a new communications and IT company may seem like a big ordeal, but if you're not